There is a body of water in the Scottish Highlands so dark that if you dropped a stone from the surface, you would lose sight of it before it sank the length of your own arm. It is 23 miles long, it is just over a mile wide, and it holds more fresh water than every lake, every reservoir, every pond in all of England and Wales combined. Yet almost none of it has ever been seen by human eyes. Not the bottom, not the middle depths, not the cold black volume where, for 15 centuries, people have sworn something moves. For over 100 years, the scientific establishment said the same 3 words again and again with the cold confidence of men who had never been wrong. There is nothing. The witnesses were mistaken. The photographs were hoaxes. The sonar was debris. The lake was simply too small, too cold, too close to hide anything larger than a salmon. That was the official position. That was settled science. And then, between 2018 and 2024, 3 completely separate teams, using methods that did not exist when the legend was born, went looking. Not for a monster, for data. One sequenced the DNA of the entire lake. One mapped its floor with a wall of sonar. One left cameras running in the dark for years. And when their findings were laid side by side, something happened that almost never happens in science. The experts stopped insisting it was nothing, because the truth they uncovered was stranger than the myth, and in some ways far older. For 1,500 years, no one could explain what was in Loch Ness. Now we can. And the answer is not what anyone wanted it to be. My name is Professor Edmund Quinn, and I want to walk you through this carefully, because this is not a story about a plesiosaur, and it is not a story about a tourist trap. It is a story about a 30-foot creature that has been hiding in plain sight in one of the most studied lakes on Earth, while the people best equipped to find it spent a century looking for the wrong thing entirely. Let me first make you understand the place, because you cannot understand the mystery until you understand the water itself, and most people have no idea what Loch Ness actually is. Picture a knife wound across the face of Scotland. That is, almost literally, what the loch sits in. It lies inside the Great Glen Fault, a colossal fracture in the planet's crust that has been grinding and shifting for roughly 400 million years, slicing diagonally from coast to coast. The land on either side of that fault has slid past itself for unimaginable stretches of time, and what it left behind was a long, narrow, brutally deep trench. Then, around 10,000 years ago, as the last great glaciers of the Ice Age retreated north, they gouged that trench deeper still, scraping out the rock with the patience only ice possesses. When the ice melted, the meltwater poured in and filled the void. And what it created was not an ordinary lake. It was something closer to an inland fjord, a sliver of frigid, lightless deep sealed inside the highlands. The numbers are difficult to hold in your head. The verified depth reaches around 755 feet, the deepest sustained basin in the entire British Isles. Some surveys of a section the locals call Edwards Deep have returned readings beyond 800 feet. To put that in human terms, you could sink most skyscrapers into Loch Ness and never see the roof break the surface. And here is the part that matters most. Down there, the temperature never changes. Summer or winter, the cold, deep water of the loch holds at roughly 5 degrees Celsius, year after year, century after century. The lake is layered, the warmer surface water floating on top of a permanent cold reservoir that the seasons cannot reach. It is, in effect, a vast refrigerator, sealed, dark, and almost perfectly isolated from the world above. Now add the darkness. This is the detail that breaks people's intuition, because we imagine lakes as clear, sunlit things you can wade into and see your own feet. Loch Ness is nothing like that. For thousands of years, the peat bogs that blanket the surrounding highlands have been leaching their tannins into the water, organic compounds that stain it the color of strong, cold tea. The result is a kind of liquid twilight. Even with professional diving equipment and powerful lights, visibility in the loch rarely exceeds 3 feet. Within the first 30 feet of depth, light fails completely. Below that, there is nothing. No glow, no shadow, no surface above you that you can swim back toward. Divers who have gone down describe a sensation closer to floating in space than swimming. Total black, total silence, and a cold that finds the seams of every suit. Think about what that means. Below the first few feet of that lake lies a volume of permanently dark, permanently cold water, larger than entire countries' worth of fresh water. A space the size of a flooded mountain valley where the sun has never reached and no human eye has ever truly looked. An animal living down there would not need to hide. It could spend its entire life in that darkness and never once rise into the thin band of murky light where a person might happen to glimpse it. It would not be hiding from us. It would simply be living somewhere we cannot go. And so the maddening truth of Loch Ness is this. It is enormous and ancient and almost entirely unobserved. We have mapped the surface of Mars in finer detail than we have mapped the inside of this one Scottish lake. For most of the 20th century, that was the convenient excuse for the skeptics and the believers alike. The skeptics could say there's no proof of anything down there, and they were right. The believers could say, but you can't prove there's nothing, and they were right too. Both sides were arguing about a place neither could actually see. That stalemate held for generations. It held through grainy photographs and midnight stakeouts. It held through expeditions funded by newspapers and millionaires, and the sheer stubbornness of people who refused to stop watching the water. The scientists drew their line, and the world stood on either side of it, and nothing moved the line for a very long time. But here is what almost nobody appreciates about the Loch Ness phenomenon, the thing that separates it from a Bigfoot blur or a flying saucer snapshot. The reports are not a modern fad. They do not begin with bored tourists and disposable cameras. They stretch backward, unbroken, consistent, stubbornly specific, across nearly 1,500 years of human memory. The same shape, the same long neck, the same humps breaking the surface in a way no native fish has any business making. Generation after generation, in a place where there was no money in it, no fame in it, nothing to gain by lying. Ordinary people kept seeing the same impossible animal in the same dark water. To understand why that matters, we have to go back, not to 1933 when the modern legend was born. Further than that, much further. We have to go back to the year 565 to a manuscript written by a monk on a windswept island off the western coast of Scotland. The account survives in the biography of Saint Columba, set down roughly a century after his death by a writer named Adamnan, the abbot of Iona, and the story he tells is brief, almost offhand, tucked among the saint's many miracles, which is exactly what makes it so strange. Columba, the chronicle says, came to the land of the Picts and found himself beside the river Ness, the fast, dark water that drains out of the loch toward the sea. There he came upon a group of locals burying a man. The dead man, they told him, had been swimming in the river when a water beast rose and seized him, dragging him under and savaging him before they could drive it off with hooks and boats. They had only just recovered the body. Now read what happens next, because the detail is everything. Columba, undeterred, ordered one of his own followers to swim across the river to fetch a small boat moored on the far bank. The man obeyed, and as he swam, the beast surfaced again. The chronicle describes it rushing upward from the depths with a great roar, jaws gaping, moving fast through the water toward the swimmer. The onlookers froze in terror. And Columba raised his hand, made the sign of the cross, and commanded the creature in the name of God to go no further, to turn back and leave the man alone. The beast, the story says, stopped as though hauled backward by ropes and fled into the deep, and the swimmer reached the shore untouched. Skeptics have a tidy explanation for this, and on the surface it sounds reasonable. Medieval saints' lives are crammed with monsters and miracles. The whole genre exists to demonstrate holy power over the wild and the demonic. A water beast cowed by the sign of the cross is exactly the kind of set piece a biographer would invent to elevate his subject. It's embellishment, they say. It's propaganda. It tells us nothing about what actually swam in the River Ness. And there's truth in that caution. But look closer, and the dismissal starts to wobble. Notice what Adamnan does not do. He does not call the creature a dragon, the great symbolic enemy that medieval writers reached for constantly. He does not give it wings, or fire, or a hoard of treasure, or any of the standard furniture of mythical beasts. He calls it, plainly, a water beast, Aquatilis bestia, a large animal that lives in the water, that attacks swimmers, that the locals already knew about and already feared. He treats it not as a wonder, but as a known local hazard, the way you might mention a stretch of road where cars keep crashing. The miracle, in the story, is Columba's authority over it. The creature itself is almost mundane, its background. It's a thing everyone in that valley already understood to be there. That is the detail that has kept this 1,400-year-old paragraph alive in the argument. Because whatever you believe about saints and signs of the cross, the account tells us something undeniable. As early as the 6th century, the people living along this water already had a story about a large, dangerous animal in it. There was no tourism. There were no cameras, no newspapers, no monster industry, no gift shops selling plush replicas at the visitor center. There was nothing to gain by inventing it. The fear in that story is simply assumed, a fact of life on the loch, as ordinary as the weather, and then, for centuries, the record goes quiet. Not because the sightings stopped, almost certainly, but because almost nobody was there to write them down. The highlands were remote, sparsely peopled, hard to reach. The southern shore of Loch Ness in particular was a wall of steep, forested hillside with no proper road, a place you traveled past by boat, or not at all. Whatever the locals saw or said about the water stayed local, passed mouth to mouth in Gaelic, in crofts and around peat fires, the way stories always traveled in places the wider world had forgotten. The Kelpie, the malevolent water horse of Highland folklore that lured travelers to drown, haunted these lochs in the oral tradition for centuries. People who lived beside the water kept their distance from it. They had reasons, even if those reasons never reached a printing press. So the legend slept in the valley, half folklore and half warning, for nearly 1,000 years. And it would have stayed there, a curiosity for antiquarians, a footnote in a saint's biography, if not for a single, almost mundane piece of civil engineering. In the early 1930s, the modern world finally came to the southern shore of Loch Ness in the form of a road. It was called the A82, and its construction changed everything. For the first time in history, the steep wooded slopes along the water were blasted, cut, and graded into a continuous drivable route. Trees came down, rock was cleared, and suddenly the long, dark, secretive northern face of the loch, the stretch that had always been hardest to see, was thrown open to anyone with an automobile and a reason to drive past. Thousands of people who had never in their lives looked at that water now had a front-row seat to it, day after day, mile after mile, the great black surface sliding by their windows. You can guess what happened next. With thousands of new eyes on the loch for the first time, the loch began, at last, to be watched. The first of the new sightings to break through arrived in the spring of 1933. A local couple, proprietors of a hotel on the shore, were driving the new road when the woman saw the water erupt. Not a ripple, not a fish, something enormous rolling and churning the surface into a froth, a dark mass that heaved up, wallowed, and sank back into the brown depths. She grabbed her husband's arm. By the time he looked, the disturbance was already smoothing over, leaving only widening rings on the surface and the certainty in her mind that she had seen something alive and immense. The local newspaper picked it up. A reporter sat with the couple, listened, and wrote the story in the cautious, slightly bemused tone of a small-town editor who suspects he may be printing nonsense but cannot resist the pull of it. The word that reporter reached for would change everything. He called it a monster. And with that single noun, 15 centuries of half-buried folklore detonated into a global sensation almost overnight. Because here is what you have to understand about timing. The early 1930s were starved for wonder. The world was deep in economic depression. Newspapers were desperate for any story that wasn't another headline about breadlines and bank failures. And here was a tale that had everything: a remote and beautiful Scottish loch, a creature older than memory, eyewitnesses who seemed entirely respectable, and a mystery that anyone, anywhere, could imagine themselves solving. The story leapt from the local paper to the national press, then across the Atlantic, then around the world. Within months, people were arriving at the shore with binoculars and folding chairs, settling in for the long wait. The road that had opened the loch to view had also opened it to obsession. And the sightings kept coming. Through that summer and the next, the reports stacked up, dozens, then hundreds. A long neck rising from the water like a periscope, a row of humps gliding in line, dark and glistening, a wake with no boat to make it. The descriptions varied in detail as they always had, but the underlying shape held remarkably steady. Something long, something serpentine, something that did not move the way any pike or salmon or otter moved. The valley that had whispered for 1,000 years was suddenly shouting, and the whole world had stopped to listen. Then came the photograph, the one you've seen even if you've never gone looking for it. A single elegant image, a slender neck and small head curving up out of calm gray water, rendered in soft, dreamlike focus. It was published in a major London newspaper in 1934, credited to a respected gynecologist, a man of standing whose profession seemed to guarantee his honesty. Surely a surgeon wouldn't lie. Surely a man like that had nothing to gain. The picture became the face of the phenomenon, reproduced in books and articles and documentaries for the next 60 years, the definitive proof in millions of minds that something impossible lived in that loch. It was a hoax, and not even a sophisticated one. The truth didn't surface until 1994, when one of the men involved, by then very old and with little left to lose, finally confessed. The famous neck and head had been sculpted from wood putty and mounted on a child's toy submarine, a model roughly a foot tall, weighted to sit upright in the shallows near the shore. The men had floated it, photographed it, and used the surgeon as a respectable front to launder the fake into the press. The whole monumental icon of the Loch Ness mystery, the image that had launched 1,000 expeditions, was 12 inches of putty and clockwork bobbing in a few feet of water. You might think that confession would have ended it, that the most famous piece of evidence collapsing into a children's toy would have drained the legend dry, sent the tourists home, closed the file for good. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is the single most important thing to grasp about this entire story. That photograph was never the foundation of the mystery. It was just the most famous decoration on top of it. Strip it away. Strip away every hoax, every blurry tourist snapshot, every excitable account, and you are still left with something the toy submarine never touched. 15 centuries of consistent reports, and a body of water so deep and dark and unexplored that science had no honest way to say what did or did not live inside it. The hoax was a distraction. The real question survived it intact. And as the decades wore on, the people asking that question stopped relying on eyes and cameras altogether. They started bringing instruments. In 1972, a team led by an American patent attorney and inventor rigged the loch with something genuinely new. Underwater cameras wired to a sonar unit, set to fire automatically the instant the sonar detected a large moving object passing through the murk. No human guessing, no human bias, just a machine, watching the dark, triggered only by mass and movement. One night, the sonar registered a contact, the cameras fired, and when the team developed the film, one frame showed a shape that made the hair stand up on the back of their necks. A large, roughly diamond-shaped appendage, suspended in the gloom, with the broad, rigid look of an enormous fin or flipper. They sent the image to a space agency's imaging laboratory, the same people who sharpened photographs of distant planets, and the enhanced version seemed to show the flipper even more clearly, an unmistakable limb hanging in the brown water. The skeptics struck back fast. They argued the enhancement hadn't revealed the flipper. It had created it, that the lab's processing had smeared random murk and sediment into the suggestion of a shape that was never really there. Show people the raw, unenhanced frame, they said, and you saw nothing but noise. The two camps never reconciled. Half the world saw a flipper. The other half saw an ink blot. And the debate, like every debate on this loch, simply hardened into trench warfare and stayed there for years. Which is exactly why, in 1987, one man decided to settle the question for good. To sweep the entire loch with sonar in a single coordinated operation so thorough that nothing large could possibly hide from it. He called it Operation Deep Scan, and what it found was harder to dismiss than anyone expected. He lined up 24 boats side by side, each fitted with sonar, and drove them down the length of the loch in a single moving wall. A curtain of sound dragged from one end of that vast dark basin to the other. The design was deliberately ruthless. Nothing of size could slip between the beams. If something large was down there, the wall would find it. It found three things. 3 separate contacts, registered at depths that suggested large, solid, moving objects, bigger than any fish anyone expected to live in that water. The sonar operators logged them, watched the traces bloom on their screens, and then watched them vanish into the cold. No camera caught them. No second pass confirmed them. They were recorded, and they were unexplained, and they were never identified. And the man who ran the whole operation, a careful, methodical investigator who had spent decades on this loch, refused to call them a monster. He stayed publicly skeptical. He simply noted that 3 large contacts had appeared where the textbook said nothing large should be, and left the rest of us to sit with that. So here is where Professor Edmund Quinn picks up the thread, because everything I have told you until now is the legend, and the legend was always a stalemate. Eyes against skeptics, hoax against history, a flipper that was either a limb or an ink blot. For 100 years, the two sides threw the same evidence back and forth, and neither could land a finishing blow. What changed, what finally cracked the stalemate open, was that the question got handed to people who weren't looking for a monster at all. In 2019, a geneticist did something almost insultingly simple. He didn't hunt. He didn't bait a hook or aim a camera. He collected water, 250 samples, drawn from across the loch and down through every layer of its depth. And then he ran them through the kind of sequencing machine that reads every scrap of genetic material floating in a sample. The skin cells, the scales, the waste, the invisible biological dust that every living thing sheds into the water around it. He wasn't testing for Nessie. He was simply cataloging every organism in the loch, building a complete census of life in the dark. And the results did 2 things at once. First, they closed a door. There was no reptile DNA. Nothing remotely resembling a plesiosaur. The dinosaur survivor dream that had haunted this loch for 90 years died quietly in a spreadsheet. No scales, no saurian signature, nothing. But the same data swung a different door wide open, because one species turned up everywhere, at every depth, in concentrations that genuinely surprised him. Eel. European eel DNA, saturating the entire water column from the shallows to the cold black floor. Now, an ordinary eel is 2, maybe 3 feet long. But eels are strange animals. Some never make the migration to the sea to breed. They simply stay, and a stay-at-home eel never stops growing. There are records of eels reaching 5, 6 feet. There was talk of an 8-footer pulled from Scottish water a century ago, and a captive eel that reportedly lived more than a century and a half. Picture several of them, dark and serpentine, breaking the surface in a slow, rolling line. And you have a long neck and humps and a movement unlike any fish. You have, in other words, the exact silhouette 1,500 years of witnesses described. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you. Eels are old, not old like a legend, old like deep time. True eels have swum the earth for at least 200 million years. They predate the dinosaurs by 50 million. They were already here when the plesiosaurs arrived, and they were still here long after the plesiosaurs were gone. The thing in the loch, if it is an eel, is not a fantasy escaped from a children's book. It is a survivor from before the dinosaurs. The monster, it turns out, may be more ancient than the monster we imagined. And if that sounds impossible, that a creature could hide in plain sight while science insisted it was gone, Remember the fish that was declared extinct alongside the dinosaurs, known only from 400 million-year-old stone, until a living one was hauled up off the African coast in a fisherman's net. Presuming extinction was never the same as proving it. The deep places kept their secrets long after we decided they had none. So when a later expedition returned with thermal drones and listening devices and recorded unexplained sounds rising from the depths, clicks and knocks with no clear source, it landed on top of the eel DNA, the 3 sonar contacts, and the 15 centuries of witnesses, and the convergence became impossible to wave away. Not one grainy photo. 3 independent methods, decades apart, all pointing at the same conclusion. Something large lives in Loch Ness. That part is no longer the question. And that is the dark twist, the part that is somehow heavier than the legend ever was. We wanted a dinosaur. We wanted a single, magnificent, impossible beast, the last of its kind, gazing up at us from another age. What the evidence offers instead is stranger and quieter. A creature so well adapted to darkness it may live and die without ever needing to be seen. A survivor that was here before everything we call ancient, hiding. Not because it is hunted, but because we simply cannot see into the water. The mystery wasn't a monster guarding a secret. The mystery was that we built a legend over a truth older and lonelier than the legend. But the thread is not fully tied, because the eel theory is not the only one on the table. One man who has watched this loch for decades believes it is an introduced catfish, a heavy bottom dweller that could prowl unseen for a human lifetime. Others point to sturgeon, armored visitors from the sea that could wander in and out. The DNA tells us what sheds cells into the water. It does not tell us how big any single animal grows, and it cannot photograph the thing that triggered 3 sonar contacts at killing depth. We have confirmed that something is there. We have not confirmed what it is. The shape in the dark still has no face, so I'll leave it with you, the way Professor Edmund Quinn leaves every case that refuses to fully close. The evidence now says something large genuinely lives in that cold, black, peat-stained water. That part of the legend was real all along. The only argument left is its name. So tell me below, when you picture what's actually down there in Edwards Deep, do you see a tangle of ancient giant eels, a lurking catfish, a wandering sturgeon, or something the instruments still haven't named? Make your case in the comments. If this opened the loch back up for you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next mystery we drag into the light.